That's, if you want a eureka moment in the Darwin story, that's when it occurred, when he's being put right, if you like, by an older man. That's how science works. It's not about solitary geniuses having brilliant insights. It's about different individuals bringing different skill sets, different contributions, putting them on the table. Collaboration is the name of the game. So the penny is sort of dropping, and now we have, famously Darwin's development as a thinker. He called this mental rioting. I love that term. So
hello everyone. Welcome to the Secular Society of MIT's third Darwin Day celebration, and thanks for coming out in this weather. It's definitely challenging, but yeah, thank you all for making it here. We're very privileged to have with us Dr. Berry today, and he'll be talking about the double discovery revolution by Darwin and Wallace, and what I can tell you is about science. Just to start with, for those who don't know us very well, we're MIT's secular student group, and we're affiliated with the Secular Student Alliance and the Center for Inquiry, and they support us. And we're also doing this in collaboration with the Greater Boston Humanists. So thank you very much to the Greater Boston Humanists for supporting this event and funding us. And we have just a quick overview of other things. We have meetups every week. Welcome to join us. And I'll give you some information about other events we have at the end of the presentation. So just to give you a little preview of what we have, we have with us today someone who has been nominated, who has been named the imported pagan priest of Darwinism, and also looks a bit like Gary Oldman, I think. Yeah,
that's why I grew up here, so I did look like Gary Oldman.
A dashing looks of Gary Oldman.
Can you show one more time the slide about the room? I didn't remember the number. About the meeting on Tuesday.
Oh, that'll be 21 at 4:50. It'll be just be at the end as well.
Okay.
Thank you. Dr. Andrew Berry was born in London, has a degree in zoology from Oxford University, and a PhD in evolutionary genetics from Princeton University. He was a Harvard Junior Fellow, is currently a lecturer on organismic and evolutionary biology at Harvard. He studies combining the techniques of field biology with molecular biology, evidence for the DNA level for Darwinian natural selection. He has published on topics as diverse as giant rats in New Guinea, mice on Atlantic Islands, aphids from the Far East, and the humble fruit fly. At Harvard, he currently co-teaches courses on evolutionary biology and also teaches a Harvard study abroad summer program based in Queen's College, Oxford, on history of science with a review of current thought in evolutionary biology. He has given lectures on evolutionary topics to popular audiences all over the world, from Ankara to the Antarctic. As an educator and popularizer, he seeks to demystify the most important and most misinterpreted of all biological ideas, evolution. Please welcome Dr. Andrew Berry.
Thank you, Sue. What a fascinating sounding person.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to one last quick announcement. We submitted to the Cambridge City Council a petition for a resolution. Councillor Quentin Zondervan took this to the Cambridge Council, a resolution, like a declaration of Darwin Day, recognizing Darwin Day. And this was voted unanimously by all 9 council members. Here it is. Some cards of Mr. of Councillor Zondervan are over here. Get in touch with them. Thank you.
Let's change one thing. What a relief. We're no longer reading my email. MIT.
Good, that's what I'm talking about. One, it's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you for being here. It's not the best of evenings in terms of travelling around Cambridge, Massachusetts, or Boston, which suggests, of course, that he, whoever it is in charge of the weather, objects to this gathering, which makes it all the more important that you're giving us a finger, so to speak, to Mr. Weather or whoever Mr. Weather, by being here. So I'm going to talk, and given a small group, please do feel free to walk in late or interrupt. I'm going to talk a little bit about Darwin, because it's Darwin Day, so we can't neglect the old geezer. I'm going to talk a little bit about this guy, Alfred Russel Wallace, who is neglected, and about whom I'm passionately enthusiastic. But the message actually has nothing to do with either of them. I think it's a super general lesson for the history of science, which is, this is a super simple idea, evolution by natural selection. You can teach it to a 7-year-old. This is not rocket science, okay? And yet, it's been sought after for about as long as people have thought about things. Why do I say that? Because every society that ever there was, and ever there is, and ever there will be, has creation myths. And the creation myth is approximating to an explanation of exactly what evolution by natural selection explains. Namely, where we came from, where biodiversity came from, and the design which is implicit and present in biodiversity. So you've got this interesting phenomenon. You've got this simple idea which explains so much, so powerfully, which is sought after for so long, and yet for various reasons, and of course you know this as well as I do, religion among them, this is a very high-hanging fruit. So plenty of smart people who engaged with these topics didn't get there. What is interesting, this is the London bus syndrome, okay? You wait. It's raining, because this is London, okay? And there's a crack in the top of the bus shelter, so you're getting soaked, okay? This is London. And then 2 buses come along, okay? That's what happened here. We have 2 independent discoveries of this theory. And they really are independent. These guys, yes, they knew each other, but they were basically forging their own path. So what does it tell us? What it tells us is this discovery is about how that high-hanging fruit, for want of a better term, became low-hanging fruit and became accessible suddenly to fairly pedestrian thinkers, frankly, Darwin and Wallace. So that's what really the history of science is. Yes, we like to think about super smart people, the grand heroes, the brilliant thinkers, the great leap forward. But actually, it's about a really messy, really fascinating confluence of technical, sociological, social, educational, political, historical factors that interweave to, if you like, bring that high-hanging fruit down. So that, I'm sorry to give the punchline away. Don't go yet. That's the message, that in a sense, these guys don't matter. What was it about the mid-Victorian milieu, if you like, which brought the high-hanging fruit down? So that's the abstract of my talk. Just to remind you, and you will know this is the best idea that anyone ever had. It really is. I mean, the bicycle is a close second, but this is. It explains so much and so simply. So I'm using sea slugs as an emblem of biological diversity because they're sort of ridiculous in terms of the diversity that they have. Whose idea was that? That is fantastic. It explains adaptation, the perfect fit of the hummingbird's bill to the base of the corolla tube to get the nectar. It explains that. We don't need a designer to give us a hummingbird's bill. And perhaps most significantly, it explains us. If you're a philosopher, you're interested in mind. Mind is an emanation of brain. and that's the really most seismic part of this theory, and the one which has provoked most resistance, is that us and our brains, wonderful, exalted, super us, humans, powerful, world-conquering humans, are modified great apes. This is a modified great ape organ. So the philosopher who's interested in mind cannot get away from the fact that ultimately what he's dealing with is the emanations of a somewhat changed great ape organ. And you know this, but this is a succinct statement of what this theory achieved and why it continues, as you know, to this day to be not controversial in any scientific sense, but socially and culturally controversial. It's more than just a biological idea. The conceptual transformation from creating the image of God to modified ape is surely the single most seismic shift in the history of ideas. Not only did the origin disabuse us of the notion that we humans are in some way set apart from the natural world, but it also provided a mechanism whereby adaptation can arise without divine intervention. So this is big. Man deposed, God disposed of, and all inside of 500 pages. Okay? As I wrote, it's perhaps not surprising this has engendered some pushback. And just to, and this is something someone asked me to bring up, just to mention pushback, I have various curious reasons. I have a strong connection to Turkey and go there, in fact, twice. In fact, I was there on the weekend to teach evolution. And with all due respect to the Turks, they need it. And especially at the moment with Erdogan's Islamists crushing everything before them. Bizarrely, until recently, it wasn't Erdogan that was the problem for the evolutionary biology community in Turkey. It was this strange organization which goes by the name of Harunyaya here, which is a brainchild of one deranged man called Adnan Oktar, who publishes extremely fancy, expensive, extraordinarily glossy books with bogus anti-evolutionary arguments in. And this is show and tell. I brought one of these, so I hope your Turkish is up to it. Do pass it around. Nothing else, to feel the weight of creationism. Please. And this is, the organisers asked me to provide a warning for your lower spine as you move this thing around. They also, and again, this might entertain you, this is one of their sort of lighter weight publications, The Evolution Deceit. This one is truly remarkable. This is the same organisation. This is the disasters Darwinism brought to humanity. This is the argument that Hitler is the spawn of Darwin, Stalin is the spawn of Darwin, Pol Pot is the spawn of Darwin. And they're there, I mean, it's like an A to Z of 20th century wankers on the front cover, along with Charles Darwin. It's actually rather fantastic. So they're actually amazingly, they're incredibly well funded. Nobody knows where the money comes from, but they have lots of it, and so they can put this stuff out all over the world. They're a sort of presence. When I'm giving public lectures in Istanbul or whatever, I won't sound heckled, but you saw that I'm rather proud of my status as a pagan priest. My favourite ever question at one of these Turkish public talks, and what often, in order to allow Turks who aren't confident speaking English, the arrangement is they write down a question and then that question is translated by someone and then passed to me. So I'm given a piece of paper. This is my favourite ever piece of paper from one of these sessions. Dr. Berry, why have you dedicated your life to a lie? It's difficult to know how to respond to that, actually, but so there's lots of great stuff these guys put out. This is one of their more recent publications, The Era of the Evolution of Species. And yes, you've already seen this. The nice thing about this is I'm not American. One. Two, but they have done a fantastic Photoshop job, so I think probably this is the closest I'll ever get to American citizenship, actually. Yeah, it's full of interesting and relevant information. So how long will this poor, pathetic resistance to creationism continue? This is self-deception. They truly resist rationalism. It's bizarre that they've tried to sort of invert the argument. Interestingly, a lot of Islamic creationism is directly translated from, borrowed from, plagiarized from American-style Southern Bible Belt creationism. So it's actually kind of interesting. This is one place in which Mr. Trump's constituency and, I don't know, Osama bin Laden and others see exactly eye to eye. This is a moment where those two Venn diagrams actually overlap, and maybe we should capitalize on and have a love fest for all of them. Mr. Oktar, who is the guiding force behind Harun Yahya, indeed personifies Harun Yahya, is a true weirdo, a wealthy weirdo. And actually, I now feel bad for him. He has, I don't know what he did wrong, but he somehow fell out of favor with Erdogan, the tyrannical Islamist president of Turkey, and he's now in jail. Which will be especially hard on him because his lifestyle has been sort of unjaily. This is him with some friends. He has a particular phenotype, I believe Ukrainian, that he's fond of. That is how you could have this figure as your inspiring religious leader is, well, difficult to believe. Anyway, moving on. Let's get back to so let's do some history of science. As I said, this is not rocket science. This is a super simple idea. I love this statement from Thomas Henry Huxley, famously Darwin's bulldog. After reading The Origin of Species, he had one of those sort of Homer Simpson duh moments. How extremely stupid not to have thought of that. That's one. And two, as I say, it's the double London bus syndrome. This is the 18th of June, 1858. Darwin gets a letter. Darwin has been now 22 years back from the Voyage of the Beagle. He's working on his big book. I mean, he actually perceived that something almost that size was going to be the book he was going to put out about his grand theory. So he's been sitting on his theory literally for a long time, and he gets this letter from Mr. Nobody, Alfred Russel Wallace, in which his theory is carefully outlined, the same damn theory. This is a rather fanciful recreation of that moment. I rather like it. This is actually a Soviet painting of Darwin in his study reading his mail, and it turns out, according to this reconstruction, that Darwin reading his mail is a sort of spectator sport, and his colleagues, Charles Lyell, the geologist, as you know, and Joseph Hooker, the botanist, happen to be sitting there watching him melt down when he sees his baby, his theory, being enunciated in somebody else's words. And I say this is about those factors that brought the high-hanging fruit down. And just to illustrate that point, here's a nice quotation. This is a quotation from Herbert Spencer. You know him as all sorts of some bad and some reasonable things. The reasonable thing is he coined the term survival of the fittest, so he's a sort of polymath, philosopher, generally sort of know-it-all mid-Victorian, friend of both Darwin and Wallace. And this is a statement he made. Now, when he says the theory of evolution, he doesn't mean it quite in the sense that we're talking about, for sure. What he's talking about is this sort of idea of progressive change, which he applied, by the way, not just to animals and plants, but to geology, to business, to manufacture, to society and everything else, but had this evolutionary worldview. I think it's a fantastic, by the way, I wish I could have made this statement. I think it's a fantastic statement. Those who cavalierly reject the theory of evolution, creationists, as not adequately supported by facts, seem quite to forget their own theory is supported by no facts at all. Like the majority of men who are born to a given belief, they demand the most rigorous proof of any adverse belief, but assume that theirs needs none. That's a fantastic statement. It's about evolution. Okay, not quite the evolution we're talking about. When was it made? Origin of Species, as you know, was published in 1859. 1852. So that, I think, is a nice distillation of the idea that, yes, the time had come. Evolution, for want of a better term, was in the air. So the question is, of course, what had put it in the air? What were the factors that brought the high-hanging fruit down? So the first part of the talk is basically a list, a discussion of those factors. But then And as I say, the idea is sort of to ignore Darwin and Wallace and say they're just a product of their time. But you can't celebrate their great achievement without getting a little Darwin and Wallacey. So we'll do the confluence of political, social, technical factors, and then talk a little bit about each individual. The first thing, and maybe it's a weird thing to say in this context of a secular society, is religion was key, in a positive way. So Britain in particular was under the spell of a theological movement known as natural theology. Natural theology took as its text Psalms 19:11, the heavens declare the glory of the Lord and the firmament showeth his handiwork. The premise is this. There are two ways to understand God. One is to read his book, read his words. The second is to, if you like, reverse engineer God from the evidence in God's creation. And this point of view, as you surely know, was most famously articulated by William Paley. That's Mr. Watchmaker. He's the one with the wonderful, and it is a wonderful image, and starts his book, suppose I strike my foot when walking across the heath against a rock. I pick that up. It's a rock, people. There's no design there. But I go further, and I now pitch my foot against a watch. And he means a fob watch. So with this exquisite circuitry, for want of a better term, all those cogs and catchments and devices. Where did that come from? Well, that was made for a purpose, he says. Clearly. Compare rock, watch, no brainer, designer. And therefore, by extension, when you look at a daffodil, when you look at a banana, when you look at a bear, they're designed. Okay? And here's this rather nice, charming little aphorism. The examination of an eye is a cure for atheism. Now, why is this helping natural science? Because it's an invitation to go study science. Science has suddenly become very respectable because what we're doing is discovering divine truths. We're discovering something about God himself. So, curiously, Darwin, when he was training to become a vicar at Cambridge, had to read Paley. He loved Paley. Okay? Darwin was a pretty damn good natural theologian. There was this huge tradition now developing over this period in Britain of the naturalist clergyman. So, and this was what Darwin aspired to be when he was in college. He would have some nice parish out in the country, and he's got very little duties, right? Okay, he's got to crank out a sermon every Sunday, but they're books of sermons, that's easy enough to figure out. He's going to spend his whole life wandering the hedgerows, collecting beetles, studying the butterflies, understanding nature, i.e. doing science. And that's what he was doing on the voyage of the Beagle. He was accumulating science specimens in order ultimately to understand God. So, as I say, bizarrely and counterintuitively, religion was an important part of the bringing down the high-hanging fruit. So too was Adam Smith. So, arguably, mid-Victorian Britain was the first historical flourishing of a society that had gone full bore Adam Smithian in terms of following that laissez-faire economics policy. This was not a clean society. It was the cut and thrust of business, of this emerging technocratic and mercantile class. And you know this quotation, I'm sure. This is from The Wealth of Nations. The premise is that competition, unfettered competition, makes things better. By pursuing his own interest, he, the capitalist, frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. So forget a planned economy. What we need is the relative anarchy of a laissez-faire economy, because that's more effective. And look, we're still living with that phenomenon today. If nothing else, you know, the notion, Apple and Samsung spend crazy amounts of money dinging each other, ads against each other and so on. They're competing, but the notion is, when you pull the camera out, that you're going to have better cell phones at the end of the day. Okay? Now, that's not very far from natural selection at all, right? The notion is you've got free competition, and the winner of the competition is the one that takes all and is the successful one. Now, natural selection is applying that same mindset to a herd of zebras, where they're competing for limited resources, they're competing amongst each other not to be eaten by the lion, and it's the sad, limping zebra at the hind of the herd that gets eaten, right? It's the same competitive process. So, I don't think it's any accident that it's coincident, the flourishing of laissez-faire and the dawn of natural selection. And both Darwin and Wallace, interestingly, allude powerfully to Malthus. Now, Malthus, I'm sure you're all familiar with the basic argument, it's very straightforward. He makes the observation that he's interested in human populations. Human populations have the capacity for exponential increase. Therefore, there are going to be checks, what he called checks to population, given the fact we've got a finite amount of resources, and those resources are unlikely to be increasing exponentially at the same rate. Okay. Now he was concerned about the human population, so he wanted, for example, poor people to show more restraint in breeding. This is not a benign theory that he was suggesting. But again, you're inches away from natural selection, and you say, okay, fine, but why was this even relevant? This was 1798 when he first published it. This was very much the talk of the Victorian chattering classes. Why? If you look at legislation at the time, you've got a lot of discussion about what to do with the slums which were developing in these urban cities. The urban poor. Previously, everyone was scattered in an agrarian society. It wasn't so in your face, and basically the village looked after its only impoverished people. Now you've got this created this urban problem. So, and that requires legislation. So there's poor law legislation, which is essentially, are we setting up something akin to a welfare state? Should we do that? Is that good for the people we're helping? So this was something that was discussed around dining room tables. It's not just an arcane piece of economic theory. This was something that Darwin and Wallace would have been talking about all the time. And yeah, as I say, you're inches away from natural selection. You've got exponential increase in natural populations. Natural populations don't increase exponentially. So what's happening? You've got a lot of mortality. Who dies? Well, that's the inside of natural selection. Those individuals which are less well genetically endowed than other individuals. Next is the Industrial Revolution. Once again, we're in first time full-on Industrial Revolution mode. It developed fastest and most effectively in Britain to start with, and this is the might of Victorian industry. This is changing the way we think about the way the world works. So previously, if I wanted to move a sack of potatoes from there to there, I would have to saddle up my donkey, plonk on the sack of potatoes, it would plod over there, and I'd get them over there. Now the donkey is a living thing. There's something mystical. It has the life force in it, if you like. It gets better.
I will be back.
Now we don't need a donkey. We just need to shovel some coal into a steam engine, and there it goes. So we've replaced the donkey, this mysterious living thing, with a thing which does just as well, which we understand. It's a machine. So, of course, these ideas of a machine-like understanding of the body have been around for a long time. Think of Descartes. But this is so in your face. It's no accident that this was in that same era, 1818. We've just celebrated the bicentenary of the publication of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And that's what this is about. This is the demystification of life, the the machinification of life, if you like. We can build a human being, for crying out loud, from spare parts, and then spark it with some electricity. So once again, we're taking this sort of mystical, magical life force out of the equation. You can see the connection, obviously, to evolutionary and natural systems. This will warm the heart of nobody in this room, except possibly me. This is the map of the British Empire. Okay, it's a little lake.
Yay.
Is it somebody else?
Well, the Canadians.
The British Empire, as you know, was sort of the big empire du jour in that Victorian era. Now, why does that matter? That's the reason that the two co-discoverers of evolution by natural selection were British. Okay? Now, I, as a Brit, might think it's just that British people are smarter than everyone else, but no. What it is, simply, is that this was a naval empire. Britain ruled the waves. What did that mean? That meant that these guys could do something which basically no generation prior could do, which was literally travel the world. Now, think about it. I'm living in Britain. I'm interested in natural history. Let's say I'm interested in butterflies. Butterflies are sexy. Okay? I should explain I'm married to a lepidopterist. I'm obliged to say that. There are 65 species of butterfly in Great Britain, and that's if you include a few sort of sad, bedraggled specimens which occasionally get blown over from the continent, which presumably won't get blown over once Brexit's occurred. Stopped by passport control. 65 species is pathetic. Okay? There are plenty of places in the Amazon basin where you can stand, hopelessly late. Nice to see you, Ariane. Where you can stand and have more than 65 species literally flying over your head. Okay? In other words, biological diversity does not exist up here. It's scattered through the tropics. We all know that. But biologists hadn't had the opportunity until just the prior generation. So it really was Humboldt. Remember, Humboldt had these great travels in North and South America. This wasn't something you could do. It didn't exist. And yet it's critical. If you're going to have an understanding of the processes that generate biodiversity, you need a window on global biodiversity. And to get that, you need an empire, which gives you free passage to wherever you want to go. And by the way, this is a fabulous reconstruction by a naval artist of the Beagle from a specific moment off the coast of the Galapagos. The Beagle, as you know, was a Royal Naval expedition. 5 years at sea, mainly about charting the southern tip of Tierra del Fuego. But that's the British Navy, which had freedom to roam literally the planet, in this case with Charles Darwin on board. So it's not just, as I'm going to talk in a moment, Wallace too benefited hugely from this imperial reach. I'm not defending imperialism, don't get me wrong, but the point is this was a key part of the multiple things that came together to make this theory suddenly accessible. And this process of global exploration and expansion, now, for the worst possible reasons, this is all about colonization and ripping people off and so on and so forth, but it's also, as a scientific component, which is, and this is somewhat acquisitive, so again, we call it scientific. This is partly because, are these things worth ripping off? Is there money to be made? Is this part of the mercantile equation? This stuff is accumulating in the great museums of Europe. For the first time, scientists of this generation, no generation prior, actually get to see the entirety of global biodiversity. Remember, no European had seen a kangaroo until Captain Cook's expedition in the 1770s to Australia. So it's, again, just this and a couple further generations where we're getting what is effectively the first global database of natural history. And that global database is the foundations of the theory of evolution. So that's my quick run through of 6 factors which together made that time, the mid-Victorian period, the 1840s, 50s, 60s, extremely, if you like, conducive to this kind of evolutionary thinking. So that's actually the punchline. But now, because I want to talk about Wallace, because I love Wallace, I've just said we're going to ignore the people. It's all about the milieu. Now I'm going to ignore what I just said and focus on the people. I want to talk about Wallace, but I can't really, on Darwin Day, not talk about Darwin. So just to remind you, this is Darwin. This is Darwin's dad. Darwin was born into privilege, and like all great men, according to their own telling of the facts, they were feckless as youths. It's just a feature of great men. Okay, it's not. It's the self-aggrandizing mythology. I mean, if you're a feckless youth, that makes your achievements all the more remarkable, right? Anyway, he remembered when I teach undergraduate, I have to translate this. He remembers his dad saying, "You care for nothing but shooting dogs," and you really need to punctuate that, right? And rat catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family. So I don't know what this is. Over extensive use of Facebook, recreational marijuana use. I don't know what rat catching is, masturbation, but whatever. Instagram, thank you. I get the two mixed up. He was sent to the local elite private school, and that, by the way, is why I stand before you. I went to Charles Darwin's high school as well, and I bill myself as the second best evolution. I don't know if it's true, but the second best evolutionary biologist to come out of Shrewsbury School. And you would imagine, look, Darwin's a hero. Just what a gift to the development office for a high school, right? Disaster. This is what he wrote. The headmaster was Dr. Butler. This is what he wrote in his autobiography. Nothing could have been worse for the development of my mind than Dr. Butler's school. Nothing could have been worse. Decapitation could not have been worse. And look, you know the story. Went to medical school, came from a medical family, didn't like watching children having limbs lopped off, which was what medicine consisted of, what pediatrics did in those days. Not unreasonably. So he goes to Cambridge, which is what you do if you're a gentleman failure. I went to Oxford. And he went, this is actually a contemporary print of Christ's College, where he was destined to become Church of England priest. One of the nice, so I mentioned, one of my clever arrangements is my university pays for me to spend a chunk of every summer. For 6 weeks, I take a group of students over to the UK, basically sort of on a Darwin/Wallace pilgrimage. So I get to visit all these places regularly, which is fantastic. One of which is, we know from the college records where Darwin lived when he was an undergraduate. So I get a kick out of taking, this is it. It's still an active and used college room. So we had to get special permission to go in there and so on. I get a special kick about the fact I'm taking in a bunch of 20-year-olds to hang out in the very space that Darwin hung out when he was 20 years old. And as you can see, they look thrilled. Now, as you know, it was not his studies, it was his passion for entomology, for beetles in particular. This is fantastic. They could draw, those Victorians. So here's Charles on his beetle, 2 Cambridge, 1 mile. He had this passion for entomology, for beetles in particular. And this is what, if you like, gave him the introduction into the world of science. So Hinslow in particular, and Sedgwick, the botanist and the geological professor, both at Cambridge. And it was through those connections that, and this is talk about privilege, he gets the invitation to go on this 5-year trip. He's just straight out of college, people. I mean, he's young, he's a know-nothing. So this is connections. And you know the story, 5 years, more or less. Most of it spent down here. So, and most of it for Darwin spent on land. So he was, we think of this heroic figure with his sort of sideburns blowing back in the wind on board the Beagle. No, he was a disaster. He was the world's worst sailor. He was so pathetically seasick. He grabbed every chance he could get off the damn thing. He spent 18 months of the entire voyage of the Beagle on the Beagle. Okay? But what we all remember, of course, is famously his visit to the Galapagos, which was only, this is basically on the way home now. We're going home the long way, across the Pacific, via Australia and South Africa. But they were only there for 5 weeks. And you know the story. This is actually a great story of oversimplification in the history of science. Most people have this perception that Darwin got there, saw those finches with their different sized bills, and instantly inferred what those different sized bills were for, and then you can almost see it in a sort of movie version, there's a sort of slow-mo eureka moment. Nothing could have been further from the truth. He completely screwed up the finches. In fact, most remarkably, this is the natural theology piece. What is natural? God designs the animals and plants to suit the environment in which they find themselves. You go to the Galapagos, you're young Darwin, pre-vicar Darwin, natural theologian, and look, there's a bunch of islands, they're all the same, right? It's just sort of dusty volcanic piles. So they say, God's not going to carefully design a finch to put on their island, and then go to another identical island and design another finch, right? No. So Darwin didn't even label the islands on which he collected his specimens. Now that is criminal. That is science 101. Oh, it's pre that. When you're on your first trip in kindergarten with Mrs. Burgess to that pond behind the school, and you had a jam jar, and you scooped up some mud or something, and Mrs. Burgess said, this does not count unless you write your name with your Sharpie and the date and the place. Data is critical. Darwin blew it off. He didn't get the finches. He certainly didn't get this idea, the fact that finches were all descended from one common ancestor. If you want a eureka moment in the Darwin story, I think this is really telling. I think it's a great statement about how science is done. It wasn't that individually brilliant insight. He sent his finches to Mr. Gould, who was London's best ornithologist. Here are the finches, by the way. Those are Darwin's actual finches. Darwin's finches, so to speak. And Gould, actually very rapidly, so about 6 months after the return of the voyage of the Beagle, March 1837, he sits the young Darwin down, and he says, you know, young Darwin, this is really interesting. These are 13 or however many, closely allied was the term he used, allied species. Today we would use closely related species, okay? That's, if you want a eureka moment in the Darwin story, that's when it occurred, when he's being put right, if you like, by an older man. That's how science works. It's not about solitary geniuses having brilliant insights. It's about different individuals bringing different skill sets, different contributions, putting them on the table. Collaboration is the name of the game. So the penny is sort of dropping, and now we have, famously Darwin's development as a thinker. He called this mental rioting. I love that term. So these are subversive, heretical ideas. He's trying to make it as a scientist, a young, up-and-coming scientist. And here, as you've all seen this before, I once had a TF in a class who got this inked halfway through the class, which I thought was a very appropriate gesture. Big tattoo on his shoulder. Other things, and I'm sure you know this, but it's always worth alluding to. Darwin was very systematic. He was also a pack rat, so we have everything that he ever did conserved. He never threw away a piece of paper, including his notes on whether to get married or not. Marry? This is the question, not marry. And so this, you want to be systematic when these are big decisions, okay? Children, if it please God, constant companion and friend in old age, who will feel interested in one, object to be beloved and play with. Better than a dog, anyhow. Quite heartwarming, isn't it? Home, someone to take care of house, charms of music and feel. I love a bit of female chit-chat. These things good for one's health. Terrible loss of time. Anyway, but I'm happy to say the conclusion is marry, 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 QED. So he marries Emma Woodward, his first cousin. But all the time, his theory is sort of coalescing, for want of a better term. 1842, he writes it out for the first time. So that's what, 6 years after the return of the Voyage of the Eagle. 1844, he writes out a long version. And he knows it's important. He knows it's radical. He knows it's heretical. He's not confident enough to publish it yet. But I love the fact you write to your wife, my dear Emma. This is extremely telling. He's actually suggested, should he die suddenly, he's beginning to feel a bit poorly. He wants to make sure that this idea is published. And 400 quid, that 400 pounds is a lot of money. He really wants this thing. He knows it's important, it's basically there. So, and there's a huge literature, I'm sure you know this, on why didn't he publish? I mean, come on, man, it's an interesting idea, stick it out there. And there are various ideas about, he didn't want to offend his religious wife and so on. I don't believe any of that stuff. What I think is important was this book. This is an evolutionary book published anonymously. Anonymously because this is heresy. We now know, I mean, it only came out after he died. It was Robert Chambers was the author of this book. Vestiges of Natural History of Creation. This book has this, it's a bit like Spencer's Evolution of Everything theory. Published in 1844, so it's evolution of the cosmos, evolution of life, evolution of the planet, evolution of society, and so on. And it's not a scientific book. It gets trashed by the scientific reviewers. But it's a bestseller. Abe Lincoln read it. Queen Victoria had her German husband read it out to her at bedtime. Ouch. Just imagine that, listening to this ghastly book in a strong German accent. But anyway, as I say, it was trashed by the reviewers. This is one of Darwin's heroes and mentors, Sedgwick, the geologist. So this is bad science. And Sedgwick, this is so uplifting. Sedgwick cannot but think that the work is from a woman's pen. It's anonymous. Everyone's trying to figure out who the anonymous author is. So well dressed and so graceful in its externals. Women writers. But what does Darwin do? He recognizes that he's got to produce something which is seriously watertight if it's going to withstand this kind of criticism. So he throws himself famously into 8 years of focused study on barnacles. He's going to establish real expertise in a particular area, and he decides barnacles will be the particular area. Till 1856, when Lyell, his geologist friend, says, there's another guy out there thinking about these things, you really should get a move on and publish. So here he is, now he's slowly working through his mega book. I got about halfway through the work on this scale, but my plans were overthrown. Drum roll. They were overthrown by Alfred Russel Wallace. Alfred Russel Wallace is a sort of generation later. He's 14 years younger. He was born in 1823. And the sort of classic story is Darwin, the sort of privileged princeling, and this poor, struggling, working class boy. Wallace, no, he wasn't working class, not remotely. I mean, yes, he wasn't born in a grand house, but it's pretty damn nice. His father was a failed lawyer, which is obviously demoralizing, but it's not deep poverty. But having said that, there was no money for education, so he left school at the age of 13. So that is a big contrast with Darwin, who had, as good an education as money could buy. So Wallace's education was pretty much on the fly. He worked with his brother as a surveyor. So this is when the railways were being put in the first time. So this is a big business, actually surveying the countryside in order to lay the lines. And in fact, this is the young Alfred Russel Wallace, and this is rather nice. It's from the Cardiff Library, signed. This is one of his early maps. And he became interested in natural history in a very naive, kind of uninformed way. He was interested in flowers. He's walking through the fields. He sees these flowers. But it wasn't until he meets this guy, Henry Walter Bates, who's actually 2 years younger than he is, but is also this sort of autodidact, self-made. He's working a trade, but he's passionately interested in beetles. And together, they become these two, they're nobodies, they're uneducated, but they're passionately interested in beetles. They collect beetles, they love beetles. And they read. They read the same damn thing. But this book has exactly the opposite effect on Wallace as it had on Darwin. It stifled Darwin. Wallace loved it. This is an ingenious hypothesis, strongly supported by some striking facts and analogies. So what they decided to do, remember they're in miserable Britain with its 65 butterflies species. They decide to go and do science and actually address this issue. But they don't have any connections. They don't know people in the Royal Navy, for crying out loud. How are they going to raise the funds to do this? They're going to basically become self-implemented, the lowest of the low in the scientific hierarchy. They're going to become professional collectors. They're going to go to an interesting place and they're going to make money by flogging specimens to museums and to individual collectors. But that's going to take them there, and they're going to see this stuff and they're going to be able to think about this stuff and see if the ingenious hypothesis actually holds water. So this, talk about a long shot. These are nobodies. They don't have any money. They don't have any connections. And they know a bit about British beetles. Yeah?
What is the ingenious hypothesis at this point?
The ingenious hypothesis is some form of transmutation that over time species or maybe genera have morphed one into another. It's not well articulated in the book, but the idea is non-fixity of species, essentially. Now, this is a moonshot, so far as we're concerned. They don't have any connection. Where are they going to go? I don't know. They go to Brazil. This is actually a figure from, it's a beautiful figure of the forest from Bates's book. What they're doing is they're looking for things like this. This is the cock of the rock. These are high, they command a good price on the natural history markets, as does something like this. This is the umbrella bird. People, if you're going to have people over to dinner and then after dinner you're going to retire to and do your show and tell, you want a couple of these babies, right? Now, they split up and Bates went south on the Solomons and Wallace went north up to the headwaters of the Rio Negro. This is real into the middle of nowhere kind of stuff. And remember, he's traveling, he's the equivalent of a backpacker. He's schlepping all his collections in dugout canoes. And he's occasionally trying to send them back downriver, hoping they'll make it to London. His brother comes out to help him and dies. He himself is nearly dead on several occasions. But the stuff he's getting is fantastic. This is all new to science. So Mr. Nobody Wallace is going to go back to Britain and be, part of the scientific establishment. And just to give you a flavour, here's David Attenborough talking about these guys. Can we turn up the sound? What is that? Sorry.
Owns a particular patch of ground is called, on which he, and he alone, displays.
So this is a neck. The female is choosing amongst the various males.
Each now has the problem of how to persuade her to land beside him. And a cock of the rock's idea for doing that is to bounce competitively.
I think it's fantastic. Anyway, that just gives you a flavour of what Wallace was actually looking at. Then finally, it's 4 years, he's nearly dead, his brother's dead, but he's got all this stuff, it's time to go home. It's time to cash in, if you like, and actually bring the amazing riches he's accumulated back home. So, travelling across the continent, he accumulates 30-odd living animals. So he's got a menagerie with him, a toucan. Just imagine walking, Mr. Nobody Wallace walks into a London salon with that baby on his arm. Spider monkey, those fantastic long arms. I mean, this is really going to make his name. 12th of July, 1852, sorry. He boards the brig Helen out of Belém. This is the ocean. And here, there he goes, okay? Now, then, they are literally, 3 weeks into the voyage, they're literally in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It's pretty much the geographic center of the Atlantic Ocean. and Wallace, this is a freighter, Wallace is the only passenger on the boat. He's therefore sharing the captain's cabin. He's still feeling a bit poorly from the bouts of yellow fever. He's probably yellow fever to survive. When there's a knock on the door of the cabin door. Mr. Wallace, it's the captain. I think you should know the ship's on fire. Now, what we think happened is it was just the movement of the ship and poorly stowed cargo, and the friction between them had created a smouldering fire. The first mistake they made, a serious one, was, oh, let's check that out. So they opened the hatch covers. Okay, so you've massively aerated this fire. This is a wooden ship that's been sitting around in the tropics. It's tinder. So they don't have any choice. They evacuate ship instantly. Wallace slides down a rope so rapidly that he takes the skin off his hands, actually. I mean, it's that panicked a departure. He has time to grab basically a Timbuktu bag. It's something about the size of stuff he was working on his desk at the time. That's all he gets. Weather's fine. So there's this dirty great big pyre in the middle of the ocean. So their best bet is hope that shipping passing by sees this and comes to check it out and maybe rescues them. Now, what does that mean? So they're going to circle the burning ship in the lifeboat. Now this is, I think, one of the most poignant sort of episodes in the history of science. They watch as each animal that, remember, these were animals that they're pets. He's had them for months as he's brought them across the country, across the continent. They're sprung from their cages by the flames and go out the bowsprit, which is the last bit of the boat that's not on fire. But even something like a parrot, a strong flying land bird, when confronted with an infinity of ocean, bails, turns around and plunges into flames. So, and Wallace writes about this. He watched as one by one these animals were incinerated. And they weren't rescued. Just by the way, in case you wonder what that looked like, it looked a bit like this. They weren't rescued 10 days. 10 days, they were out of water by that stage. So 10 days adrift in an open boat in the middle of the Atlantic. And as soon as they were rescued, Wallace wrote this famous letter to his friend Spruce, a botanist in Brazil, in which he basically gave a sort of moment by moment breakdown of what happened. And there's this, this sort of says a lot about Wallace in a sort of stiff upper lip kind of way, or putting a positive spin on things. So I think it was just 3 nights into this lonely drift across the middle of the Atlantic. During the night I saw several meteors, and in fact could not be in a better position for observing them than lying on my back in a small boat in the middle of the Atlantic. That's putting a positive spin on things, I have to say. Now, so he got back to Britain finally. He's lost everything. He's still a nobody. Now, I don't know about you, but I would throw in my chips and, this is MIT, so work for Facebook. Sell out, or become a management consultant, for crying out loud, or an accountant. No, within 18 months he was on another boat, this time to Singapore, and so that was 4 years in the Amazon. It's now 8 years traveling through Southeast Asia. This is his own map, and the black lines are the journeys he made. So here's Borneo, this is Singapore. It's stunning the amount of territory that he covered, the places he went to, and the material he brought back. This time it all went okay. And it's, of course, basically it's the same gig. Because he hasn't made it, he's still a nobody, so he's selling specimens for a living. And of course, it's no longer umbrella birds and cock of the rocks. These are the high-profile specimens. These are birds of paradise, of course. This is Wallace's standard ring. This is a species he actually discovered. And again, just to give you a flavour, this is the stuff he was looking at. You've all seen this, but you can't see it too often. Exhausting, isn't it?
Success.
Thank you, David. effectiveness as a collector, I think this is an extraordinary statistic. He described, and some of them have since been synonymized, but it's still a pretty good guesstimate, over 200 new species of birds on this tree. Over 200. Now, birds are difficult to find new ones of because people care about birds and notice birds. This isn't nematode species, okay? In other words, he discovered, personally, in those 8 years, 2% of all bird species. That's amazing. Two other great achievements, of which the second is the biggie that we're talking about, which is evolution by natural selection. Another one is the purely empirical discovery of this biogeographic discontinuity between the Asian flora and fauna and the Australasian flora and fauna. We understand where this comes from now. We understand the plate tectonics of the situation. But he noticed it by just noting differences between these two islands, Bali and Lombok. It became known, this has become known, and I hasten to say it was nothing to do with Wallace calling it Wallace's line, it was Huxley who called it Wallace's line. But the biggie, of course, is evolution by natural selection. He discovered this in two discrete steps. This is northern Borneo, Sarawak. He was living at the base of this mountain during a rainy season and thinking hard about things. He wrote a paper which has become known as the Sarawak Law in 1855. States that every species has come into existence coincident both in space and time with a pre-existing closely allied species. Both space and time. So what does that mean? Let's think space. If I find a kangaroo in Australia, where do I look for similar allied things? Wallabies, if you like, paddy melons. Do I go to Cambridge, Massachusetts? No, of course I don't. I'm going to find them in the same damn place. Why? Because you've got a genealogical process, an ancestor-descendant process. So you had the original kangaroo, and that has spawned subsequent new species of roos and related species. So that's the spatial piece. Same if I look in the fossil record. I find ceratopsin dinosaurs in this stratum. Do I now look for similar ones? Do I look much more modern or much more ancient in much lower strata? No, of course not. I'm going to find similar things in contiguous strata. Why? Same damn thing. It's a genealogical process, right? Ancestor, descendant. So this is half of the theory of evolution by natural selection. This is what Darwin called descent with modification. And Wallace, remember, he's still a nobody. Sends us off. This is gonna rock some boats. People are gonna angry letters to the editor. Who is this Mr. Wallace? How can he be so heretical? How can he be so irreligious? And he's actually is crushingly disappointed. Nothing happens. It's the normal thing in science. You think you've made a great achievement and nobody's read your bloody paper, right? So he has nothing, except he's heard from the august Mr. Darwin, one of his heroes. He read The Voyage of the Beagle. He loves The Voyage of the Beagle. Mr. Darwin is actually interested in acquiring some specimens from the specimen collector, and they have a sort of desultory exchange, which Wallace says, I wrote this paper and nobody cared, and it's super interesting. And Darwin writes back quite carefully. He says, well, don't worry, people tend to be a bit narrow-minded about these sort of things, and I'm working on something related to this, so keep going. Darwin didn't feel threatened by this, but Lyell realised that Wallace was moving in that direction. So that was why Lyell told Darwin, get a move on, mate. And that was good advice. Because the next of Wallace's breakthroughs, of course, was early 1858. He's in the Moluccan Islands, based on Ternate. And we think he probably had malaria, we don't know. He was in bed, tossing and turning, going in and out of fever delirium. And he glimpsed an idea, which we today call natural selection. And he knew it was a good idea, and so as soon as he was capable, he wrote it down. And then he did something very unusual for him. He's a fairly experienced scientist. He's published plenty of papers, and he has good relationships with editors and so on in London. And instead of sending his idea directly to a journal, he says, well, remember what happened last time with my good idea? Nobody paid any attention to it. So what I'm going to do is try and use my limited connections in the upper echelons of science. So the person I think who would be most interested in it is Mr. Lyell, the geologist. And who is known to be a good friend of him? Well, my correspondent, Charles Darwin. This is the luckiest thing that ever happened to Charles Darwin. Because if Wallace had just sent his manuscript off to a journal and been published 3 months later, then Darwin would have been scooped. Right? But no, that's not what happened. And so here we are, we're back on the 18th of June, 1858. Here we actually have it, the postman knocking on the door of Down House. Here is Down House. Here's still Down House. And here's the bogus painting. So, you know, you've got to feel for poor Darwin. This is his response. He writes to Lyell. So all my originality. So he's been nursing this idea for decades. And he's a scientist. He doesn't have anything else. Doesn't get a good income from his science. He doesn't have access to beautiful young women through his science. No. All he's got is his idea. It's his identity. And he thinks it's about to be snatched from him. So all my originality, whatever it may amount to, will be smashed. But he's a decent bloke, to say, to give him his due. I would far rather burn my whole book than he or any man should think that I behaved in a paltry spirit. Now, he might have been tempted. Southeast Asia, do you know how many boats, how many trains, how many carriages that thing travelled on? He could have dropped it in the grate, and then when Mr. Wallace showed up next time and said, "Did you get my letter?" He goes, "Oh, no, must have gone down at sea." Okay? So, no, he did the right thing by insisting that he would honour Wallace, but it's the intervention of Lyell, the geologist, and Hooker, the botanist, that resulted in what has been called a delicate arrangement. So just 2 weeks later, the Linnaean Society, which is a sort of premier biological venue in London, Lyell and Hooker present it's not a joint paper. It's actually a very bizarre piece of science. A joint paper is we have two authors who come together to write a paper. This is two authors who've written one paper, which are two statements of the same idea. So they cobbled together some of Darwin's writings on the subject and put out Wallace's manuscript. Darwin, by the way, wasn't there because he'd had a bad couple of weeks. His infant son, Charles Waring Darwin, had died in that 2 week period. So he was actually at the funeral of his baby on the day this was announced. Wallace doesn't know about this, and this is a bit dodgy. If I were to send a paper, my best idea, to an august colleague, senior colleague, "Dear Professor Orszag, what do you think of my manuscript? Where should I publish this?" This is Steve Orszag, by the way. And then I sort of hear nothing for some time until I pick up my copy of Nature, and there it is, Orszag and Berry. Okay? I hadn't suggested that we co-publish, right? I've been sort of railroaded by this arsehole. So, there are definitely sort of ethical publishing issues here. As we'll see, they didn't worry Wallace. So here is the Linnaean Society. Here are some of my students being inappropriately disrespectful at such an august place. And here's the paper. Okay? Now, so the cat is out of the bag, so to speak. How did Wallace respond? As I say, he had plenty of grounds to gripe. Excuse me. He didn't. So he gets letters. And I love this. This is a letter he sent to his mother. "Dear Mummy, I've received letters about this essay." He showed it to Dr. and Sir Charles, who thought so highly of it, they immediately read it before the Linnaean Society. This is the point. He's gone from nobody to somebody. This assures me the acquaintance and assistance of these eminent men on my return home. What does Darwin do? You know what Darwin does? He knuckles down, he throws away, he doesn't throw away the manuscript for the big book, but he basically pares it down to a condensed version. He wanted John Murray, his publisher, to include in the title the word abstract. A 500-page abstract. As Murray said, actually, I think 500 pages is more than an abstract, Charles, actually. Now, The Origin of Species came out a little more than a year later, and it's Darwin's book. Wallace is barely mentioned. Okay? This is Darwin's theory. This is my theory, my theory, my theory. Does Wallace mind? No, you've got to love Wallace. But we know, by the way, now that Wallace had been planning his own equivalent book, and he nixed that project when he discovered what Darwin was doing. Mr. Darwin has given the world a new science. His name should, in my opinion, stand above that of every philosopher of ancient and of modern times. The force of admiration can no further go. That's such a great statement. Wallace came back several years later, 1862, and he and Darwin became good friends, but still had plenty of disagreements. But boy, this is a great relationship. So they had disagreements about sexual selection and the role of natural selection in human evolution. And you read the correspondence, it's fantastic. This is no holds barred. It's all respectful. It's not ad hominem. They're having real arguments in letter form. And then finally, it's 1871, Darwin is about to publish The Same Man, which is about two things: human evolution and sexual selection. So he writes, fate has ordained that almost every point on which we differ should be crowded in this volume. Sorry, mate, this is a sort of greatest hits of disagreement for you. I love Wallace's response. I look forward with fear and trembling to being crushed under a man of facts. Bring it on, man! Bring it on! Done, basically. As I said, I wasn't going to talk about the two individuals, and I've talked at great length about the two individuals, but they're great stories and they're worth knowing. And if you already knew them, it's worth revisiting them. One of the interesting things about Wallace is his obscurity. He's the guy who co-discovered this idea, and yet you Google evolution. Do you see that face? No, you see that lugubrious, depressed, bulging forehead, bearded head. That's Darwin. You could quantify this in a sort of 21st century kind of way. This is data from Wikipedia page hits for about a year ago. Very much a year ago, because there's Darwin's birthday. So, 3 points here. Green is Wallace, and blue is Darwin. So Darwin is getting about an order of magnitude greater page hits as our modern metric of notoriety of fame than Wallace. That's one interesting thing. The second interesting thing is people are only interested in them on a weekday basis, which is you've got this interesting 7-day cycle, which presumably is when students have been assigned homework to go and do something, and apparently students don't work on weekends, not like in my day. And finally, I do like this. Oh, it's Darwin's birthday. How should we celebrate that? Let's look him up on Wikipedia. So Wallace is almost famous for not being famous. Now, what happened to him? And there's a whole, needless to say, really long lecture that I could give you on that topic. It's fascinating. There are all sorts of interesting ideas. But I'm going to give you 2 sort of take-homes on that. One is, in some ways, I think his mistake, his finest moment was his biggest mistake in terms of posterity. So Darwin was already established. He was a famous guy. He was the author of The Voyage of the Beagle and so on and so forth. So the fact that Mr. Wallace is associated with him is inevitably seen as an offsider, as a flunky, as a minor character. So we're interested in Sherlock Holmes. We don't care about Dr. Watson. And that's the situation. Darwin is Holmes, and there was the other guy who sort of hung around with him, right? So coupling their 2 stars together, I think, did Wallace a disservice. Another one was he almost pathologically wrote himself out of his own story. And there's almost something sort of unhealthily modest about him. As you see, every time Darwin and his colleagues do something slightly unethical, Wallace says, yeah, that's fine, that's nice, do more, stamp on me. He, as much later in life, in the 1880s, so Darwin's died, Wallace actually tours the United States, comes to Boston. He loved the Museum of Comparative Zoology. Yes?
So the origin of species is still read widely.
Yep.
And even a lot of early scientific documents are typically not, the originals aren't read very much.
Right.
People learn about them. But the origin of species is still read pretty widely. So I'm curious then about Wallace's original papers. Like, what was the level of quality in the writing, in the communication with you?
Wallace's writing is hugely superior to Darwin's.
Is it?
Now, I might be biased.
Yeah.
So this is a minor digression just on that point. Wallace was a right, one draft off to the editor. And he wrote, I could give you beautiful passages that he's written Darwin was a scribbler and a scratch, 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 edit, edit, edit. Read The Origin of Species, bits of it are almost indigestible. I mean, there's awkward, complex syntax and sort of sentences that literally last 2/3 of a page and so on. But when he gets it right, like the famous the final paragraph of The Origin, or indeed the final paragraph, he's good on final paragraphs on the descent of man, he's golden. So it's rather heterogeneous. Wallace is, in my opinion, a much better writer. And you can run the experiment yourself. So they both wrote well-known travel books. The Voyage of the Beagle. Wallace wrote a beautiful book, The Malay Archipelago, in 1869, which was on the 8 years he spent in the field there. Read those two side by side, and you'll fall in love with Wallace. So Wallace was actually a fantastic communicator. One of the problems, actually, he was in some ways too good a communicator. He became, unlike Darwin, he's a famous scientist, and he sticks to doing what he's supposed to do. He's a scientist, and he keeps publishing important scientific books and doing great science. Wallace comes back from Southeast Asia. He's now a well-thought-of, heralded scientist. He keeps doing science, but boy, he uses his newfound fame to proselytize, to push whatever he's into at the moment. So he was a very early socialist. He was the president of the Land Nationalization Society that argued that ownership of land was pernicious and that everyone should have equal rights to land ownership. He was, this is unfortunate, a spiritualist. So he became convinced. He would go to seances. He thought he liked this. This was empirically verifiable. So far as he was concerned, he was sitting at the seance table and that's Auntie Brenda, who died last year, telling you something completely inane. He was a dupe for that, but he wrote exquisitely and effectively about it. So that's sort of part of the problem. He was such a good communicator, and he sprayed himself so wide. And he made tons of mistakes. He also was a bit of a fan, believe it or not, of phrenology, which is the science of inferring your future, your personality, from the lumps and bumps on the surface of your skull. But to read Wallace is to love Wallace. And I challenge anyone to run the experiment on themselves and come up with a different conclusion. But my conclusion to this talk, and just to return to the issue of what happened to Wallace, and as I say, he kind of wrote himself out of the story. He had this plan to write a book on evolution when he was in the field, before he knew that Darwin was writing on The Origin of Species, and then he suspended and killed it. He wrote other books like The Malay Archipelago. He wrote over 20 books in his lifetime. But he came here, and he gave a bunch of lectures on evolution, and people loved it. And people came up to him afterwards and said, look, I've read The Origin of Species, I kind of got it, but now I really got it because you explain things really well. Could you turn these lectures into a book? So his one big sort of equivalent of The Origin of Species he published in the 1880s 1889, after coming back from this US tour. What did he title this volume? This is Alfred Russel Wallace's grand summary of evolutionary thought. Darwinism. That's what I mean. He basically wrote himself out of the story. And that, slightly poignant note, is where I will finish. Thank you very much. Way over, I'm sorry. Yes. Oh, and so we do have time for questions.
Shall we take like about 7:25? So we take about 20 minutes of questions and then
Whatever. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Fantastic lecture presentation. Very entertaining. I was thinking of the lecturers in the over 100 years ago, traveling lecturers, and the way we work with images and other things. I have 3 questions, brief.
Yep.
I hope. The first is the relationship of Wallace in particular with 2 figures here in Cambridge, one of whom I've seen his gravesite in the Harvard Cemetery, Asa Gray.
Asa Gray, yeah.
And not as much interested in Agassiz, but if he had anything to say about that. Secondly, I didn't quite understand. He wrote back to Lyell. I didn't quite understand how he wrote to Lyell. Lyell shared it with Darwin.
No, it was the other way around.
Okay.
So he wrote to Darwin. He knew Darwin. He had a. So let me do question one first, which is the relationship. When he came here, there are two prominent biologists at Harvard, both of whom were very involved with Darwin. One of them was Asa Gray, who was a botanist, who was arguably Darwin's strongest and first supporter in this country, and he arranged actually for the American edition of The Origin of Species to be published and so on. There was always a little bit of tension between them because Asa Gray was deeply religious, but so he sort of was on board as much as he was comfortable with natural selection. But for instance, he believed that maybe God was involved in the natural selection equation by ordaining variation. So that was the divine input into evolution. The correspondence between Darwin and Asa Gray is wonderful. And my favourite comment, Asa Gray sort of wringing his hands and saying, you can't throw God out just because you've got this theory. And Darwin is basically agreeing. He's saying, yeah, these mysteries, they're beyond us. I mean, the things we're talking about in sort of primal causation kind of issues and so on. And he has this lovely statement. He says, look, we can't understand it. A dog might as well speculate on the mind of Newton. That's a great statement about mystery. Agassiz, of course, is a completely different kettle of fish. He wrote that shortly after The Origin of Species came out, that the more I study, the more convinced I am wrong that this business coming from Britain, coming across the Atlantic, is wrong. I hope I outlive this current mania, he wrote. He didn't. So Agassiz was absolutely Darwin's. Agassiz was a superstar scientist, super big, famous, global personality, and so that was a sort of serious head-butting with Darwin. Agassiz died 1872, I think. So it was 10 years before Darwin. So he died actually, not that long after The Origin of Species. So, and I don't know actually when Gray died, but I don't think there was a close relationship between Wallace and Gray. Wallace came here, I think, in 1886, 87. And by the way, he traveled across the country. His brother had emigrated to California in 49. And so he went to have a reunion with his brother, sort of 40 years on, which is a rather nice thought, and met, among others, John Muir, who gave him a tour of the Redwoods, which is kind of cool. So I don't think, Wallace didn't have a direct relationship with either character. However, there's a lovely passage in the essay that Wallace wrote about his visit to Harvard's Museum of Comparative Zoology, which was absolutely Agassiz's brainchild. This was Agassiz's baby. And it was a grand vision. This was a comprehensive academic collection of every species on the planet. And the vision is pure natural theology. Again, we're going to understand God that way. Okay? And Agassiz revolutionized museum display. So traditionally, you put all the birds in this room and all the reptiles in that room. Okay? He said, no, remember, God is designing things for their place. So here's Australia. God's going to design kangaroos and kookaburras and so on and so forth and put them here. So there's no point in putting the kangaroos in that room and the kookaburras in that room because God has them together in Australia. So he invented biogeographic display of organisms in museums, which is actually a super smart way to do it, not for the natural theological reason. So he's long since dead. Wallace visits. He writes this essay. He says, isn't it ironic that evolution's greatest opponent, Mr. Agassiz, should inadvertently create the best possible vehicle for advertising, for explaining for laying out the theory, because you go into the Australia room and you see the radiation of kangaroos and related species. It sort of hits you in the head, as opposed to going into the old style mammal room, and Wallace directly criticizes the Natural History Museum in London in the same paragraph, where you've got endless, you find, there's lions and tigers and rhinos and kangaroos and otters. You don't get any sense out of that. So even though Wallace and Agassiz didn't have a direct relationship, they had a really interesting indirect relationship. On to your second question, which is, yes, the mechanics of the 18th of June 1858 exchange. The Principles of Geology, which is Lyell's famous work, includes, rather surprisingly to everyone, I suppose, a rather lengthy slab of text critiquing Lamarck. So Lamarck, remember, pre-Darwin, pre-Wallace, was the transmutation theory du jour. And Lyell does a really good job taking it down. So Lyell is top dog in terms of anti-transmutation. Now, Wallace has been reading Lyell very seriously. Remember the Sarawak Law paper, the time and space. He could do the space thing himself, but he wasn't looking at the fossil record in Borneo. He was reading Lyell and making inferences from Lyell. So he knew Lyell chapter and verse. And you can look at his notebooks, so the notes he was taking in the field when he was in Southeast Asia. He's sort of developing his evolutionary ideas, and everything is measured against Lyell. Have I knocked Lyell down on this anti-transmutation point? Yes or no? So Lyell was the ultimate litmus test for the success of an evolutionary idea. Now, he had no connection to Lyell.
Countering Lyell?
Yes.
Yeah.
So he wants to see whether his idea, so the ultimate test of his evolutionary ideas, to put them to Mr. Lyell, the best and most effective anti-evolutionist in the scientific establishment. So if his ideas can survive Lyell, then he's in good shape. And he didn't have direct access to Lyell. Lyell was extremely august and so on and so forth. But he did have a correspondence, as I've said, with Darwin, and Darwin was a mate of Lyell's. So Darwin was his conduit to Lyell. Number 3, want to be complete.
Well, about God. And
Oh God, okay, yes,
Well,
that's always the third question.
Darwin's idea, I remember reading something, and I think it was either his widow, or if she survived him, or there was some editorial in one edition of The Origin of Species, maybe, where there's somewhere Darwin talking about God, and maybe if you could amplify on what you already said about that, where he seems to be saying, well, I don't know, but you would know better. What his views about that kind of
controversial, and especially at a place like the MIT, so like Secular Society,
right.
We're celebrating Darwin Day because Darwin has been adopted as a sort of banner for atheism.
Right.
I don't think he was an atheist,
Either, yeah.
nor would, so somebody I teach a course with up the road is Janet Brown, who wrote this exquisite and massive 2-volume biography. This is the final word on Darwin. She literally knows what he had for breakfast on the 3rd of July, 1846. And she also sort of bristles a little bit at the idea that he was an atheist. Now, he absolutely rejected doctrinaire Christianity. He didn't go to church. And there's a famous passage in his autobiography in which he discusses, for want of a better term, the immortal souls of his brother and father who were unbelievers. So his older brother Erasmus, who was his best mate, loved him, was buried in Down churchyard, actually. I mean, that was where they chose to bury his brother. And he writes that, according to conventional religion, because they were unbelievers, they're condemned to the fires of hell. They are damned to the fires of hell. And he writes, this is a damnable doctrine. He's having none of that. So that's out the window. But as I say, and I just gave you that quotation in the exchange with Gray, I think that's quite illuminating. He's you know, maybe a mild agnostic. He's happy not to deal with deep mysteries. And by the way, he never really grappled with the origin of life. He felt evolution was something that happened once you had life, so that was a different problem. And he didn't really, I mean, he did write a little bit about it in his correspondence and publish anything on it. Yes, sir.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, I remember he wrote a letter to his wife during the time his son was sick, and in relationship to his disgust with religion, organized religion at that. Correct me if I'm wrong.
So the most famous passage, and this is oft discussed, and I think is a reasonable conjecture, is when his oldest daughter Annie, whom he absolutely doted on, she was 10, and we don't know what killed her. It's probably like all Victorian children, some form of strep that killed her. But he actually took her to Malvern, which is a spa town, in the hope that she could be cured there. Emma stayed at home. She was pregnant, I think aged 44, with their 10th child at the time. And it's one of the most poignant correspondences you can ever hope to read, actually. Because remember, this is an era when there were like 4 or 5 mail deliveries a day. So you know, they're writing letters like we'd be texting or emailing. And he's writing hour by hour bulletins, writing Emma, hour bulletins about Annie's health and how she seems to be doing better, and I feel good about this, and she just smiled at me. And then, oh, she's going downhill again, I don't know how long, you know. And then finally she dies, and it's brutal. He's crushed.
Yeah, no,
And the idea is, the claim is, that was the moment when any formal connection between, if you like, standard Christianity, which remember he'd been trained to be a vicar in, that snapped at that moment. No benign, loving God would let so perfect, so innocent, so loving a child die in such unpleasant circumstances.
Thank you for that. 'Cause that was my understanding. That letter was deep, and he was constantly, you're right, he was constantly writing back, and he was struggling with his own faith at that time because of his love for his God.
Yeah.
You know? The other thing is...
Oh, sorry. No, keep going.
The Cambrian explosion and timeline...
Man, we're moving around. Yeah.
I just, give me your idea what the timeline is with Cambrian explosion.
The timeline? What do you mean?
Darwin was familiar with the Cambrian explosion, that was already out there.
No. Darwin had very little knowledge of the fossil record. So the fossil record was very poorly developed at that stage. And the Cambrian explosion is remote in terms of the fossil record. I mean, we have this general problem that we have quite a good fossil record if you go back, say, 50 million years. But if you go back further, the fossils that were formed have eroded away or been subducted by tectonic action or whatever. So even finding anything that dates to 500 million years old, i.e. approximately the era of the Cambrian explosion, is hard. 1. 2, the fossils from that era are almost uniformly, except for so-called small shelly stuff, soft-bodied. So even with good fossil records, you don't find soft-bodied things because they don't preserve. That's hence the importance of, for example, the Burgess shell, and now we have a number of contemporaneous faunas, fossil faunas. But that was, the Burgess shell was discovered, I think, in the 1920s. 1909, thank you, Steve.
Thank you, that's what I was saying.
So no, Darwin didn't have, that wasn't a problem, it just didn't exist in Darwin's sort of worldview.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Going back to the very briefly issue of God and stuff, there is the issue about the last paragraph of the Origin of Species, right? The difference between the first edition.
That's right. The first edition, there is no mention of God, so he uses a passive voice that life was breathed in to early forms. But then in the second edition, he will stick in a creator. Okay.
Is there any reference to this particular thing in the correspondence between Darwin and Wallace? As far as you know?
Oh, interesting question. I don't know. I don't know if Wallace sort of objected. So I can give you some. So I don't know. There might be. Is a short answer. But I can give you an instance which is really well worked out in their correspondence, which is slightly equivalent.
Well, but what did he say in the revised edition?
Oh, so whereas it was just passive voice, life was breathed into one or few forms, the creator, it becomes active. And there's a creator in the second and later editions. Wallace hated the term natural selection. And he actually begged Darwin to change it. And if you look at Wallace's personal copy of The Origin of Species, it's very cute, actually. He's gone through, crossed out natural selection each time, and written survival of the fittest. He really preferred Spencer's term. Now, and there's extensive correspondence between the two of them. And Wallace sort of wins, but Darwin says, sorry mate, it's too late. It's called natural selection. There's no going back, okay? I mean, it's out there. That's what people are talking about. And the reason Wallace didn't like it, I think it's a really good reason, and it sort of relates to what you're talking about, is natural selection, called natural selection by analogy to artificial selection. As you know, the first chapter of The Origin of Species is all about artificial selection, pigeons in fact, okay? And the premise, of course, is a good one, that his Victorian audience were very familiar with what artificial selectors did. So pigeon breeders took the weirdest, you know, if you want one with a fluffy, frilly neck or whatever, you take the fluffiest one and you breed that with the next fluffiest one. We knew how that worked, okay? And therefore, by analogy, that's what is happening in nature. So you can provoke considerable change over a few generations with artificial selection. Same can happen with nature. Wallace hated this. He said the whole bloody point of artificial selection is there's a person, the pigeon breeder, or the farmer, or the plant breeder, or whoever it is, who's doing the choosing, who's doing the breeding, right? So it's a deliberate teleological process. And the whole goddamn point of natural selection is it is not deliberate, it's not teleological. There is no selector. So by insisting on the analogy, Mr. Darwin, what you're doing is implying that there is a selector, and who's that selector going to be in the popular imagination? Huh? G-O-D, right? So, yeah, I think that's a very illuminating exchange, and I think Wallace is super smart on this. Yeah.
He even uses it in his book, though.
Oh, God, yes. No, this is the whole...
It's a total...
Yeah, total keel to pure, unalloyed deference. Yes, ma'am.
So does Wallace differentiate between natural selection and survival of the fittest?
As I say, he hates the term natural selection.
He differentiates.
No, he didn't. He made no distinction. He literally asked Darwin to change all his references in future editions of The Origin of Species to natural selection, to change them to survival of the fittest. So he liked the term survival of the fittest. Needless to say, at that stage, people hadn't raised the stupid modern gripes about the term survival of the fittest, that it's tautological and so on. What are the fittest? The ones that survive. So that becomes meaningless if you insist on defining fitness as in terms of survival, but there are plenty of ways in which you can define fitness independently of survival. And it's the fact that could be, say, if this is the selection pressure du jour, the fastest running are the fittest and therefore survive. So no, there was no particular conflict there. Yes, sir?
When I saw the poster twice, I thought, well, first you're going to speak about Darwin, and twice means we're going to get some food from Darwin's food truck in Central Square.
Well, actually, that would have been thrice, because there are now 3 Darwins. There's one on Cambridge Street, and one in Central Square, and one on Mount Auburn Street. So that's a different talk.
So this weekend we are going on an excursion to the Illinois Grove Reservation. After that, we're going to have coffee at Darwin on Mount Auburn.
So,
Yeah.
So did the word Darwinism ever catch on with people who agreed with the theory? And if it did, how did the creationists end up getting a monopoly on it?
Why do you say the creationists have a monopoly on the term Darwinism?
Just because nowadays, every time I see the term, it seems to be in, well, some kind of word like Yaya's book.
Oh, okay. So no. I mean, I teach a course with Janet Brown entitled Understanding Darwinism. And that the premise is, she's talking about the history of science, how did we get to Darwinism, and then I'm trying to explain Darwinism. But you're dead right, it's a really interesting history of the term. And by the way, guess who first, if you like, pushed for it? Within 7 or 8 years of the publication of The Origin of Species, Wallace was suggesting that we use the term Darwinianism. Okay? So he had an extra syllable in there, because again he felt that Mr. Darwin should get all due credit. And it was only subsequently, and I don't know the full history of who was the first person who actually used the term Darwinism, but it certainly, it was Haeckel. So Haeckel was a German disciple of Darwin. It's certainly, the theory had already become co-identified with Darwin. And I think that's what the creationists are about. It's the notion, it's just a theory thing. So if we're calling it Darwinism, and we can demonstrate that Darwin is a flawed, feeble, single human being, then the whole theory, by extension, collapses. But no, the theory is still, I mean, the term is certainly still in scientific parlance as well as in, as you're right, creationist polemics.
All right,
Well, did Darwin is there any record of Darwin having explained whatever objections he might have had to the survival of the fittest? And by the way, is there anything known about why he changed the last paragraph in later editions?
So one, Darwin didn't object to survival of the fittest. He liked the term. And actually, if you look at some of the later editions, he sort of goes a little bit of the way that Wallace wanted him to go. So he does introduce the term survival of the fittest from time to time. Sorry, what was the second point?
Well, why he changed it.
Oh, yeah. Sensitivity to the reaction. So there are all sorts of things that he brought in. One gripe was, excuse me, what about all the other people who've thought about this stuff? You haven't referenced them, you haven't even acknowledged them. So he introduced a historical sketch to sort of show the development of these ideas. And essentially, from the first edition, which is, it was rushed out. Remember, this was a sprint to the finish line because he was worried that Wallace was going to really scoop him. It was then, and there were 6 editions published in his lifetime. It was a sort of softening it, making it more acceptable. So the first edition is the one to read. This is the argument as actually proposed. It's like he then talked to PR people who said, you can't say this, you really should do this, and everything got sort of, all the edges got smoothed off and the corners got rounded.
all right, well, thank you for that. Let's pick up the last.
There's one last patient person here.
I think this could be quick. Do we have time, Simon?
Well, if it's a quick one, then
It's
we'll
always
make this
gonna be
last one.
more.
Okay, yeah.
The question is on the emphasis between competition and collaboration in the survival of the fittest. What at the time, was there a difference in the emphasis of the understanding of these two men on that score?
I would say no, but to start with, both were fairly sort of wed to the notion of competition. That's why they both explicitly referred to Malthus as very influential on their thinking. Wallace, as he gets older, and this is one of the reasons he's got shoved under the rug, becomes less and less, if you like, doctrinaire in his embrace of Darwinian ideas, and does become, and he starts having a sort of a rather, frankly, you might say almost new agey thoughts about harmony and community in nature. And so there's then this sort of Kropotkin-esque vision of collaboration and cooperation sort of enters his thinking, but only much later.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. And couple of quick notes. So just yeah, again we're having meetups every Tuesday. W20 450. You were asking about the yeah. So and an upcoming event, we're having an event where an ex-Mormon is going to be talking about his journey out of the religion. That's on March 12th. On April 4th, we're having another out-and-out event with an ex-evangelical. And we're going to be having a little like afternoon conference thing with Muslimish on April 27th. So thank you everyone, and thank you also to Greater Boston Humanists and for supporting this event. And thank you, Dr. Berry.
Thank you.
So entertaining. Somebody's got great experience.
The God thing, as some people say, would say that he did. But what I found was
together, our two beats make a very good beat. Yeah, right. In fact, it looks like a bird is speaking to us. It's speaking to us. Top and the bottom. Yeah, exactly.